Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. This series features discourse on topics pertinent to the C-level conversation revolving the integration of artificial intelligence into the ever-evolving IT operations landscape. Discover trends and actionable tips for digital transformation, as well as the latest news on how AIOps is transforming business and government operations to create flow in their organization. And don't stay in the dark on the latest industry news. Join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOPSevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Weekly Evolution broadcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. Bill, how you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm doing pretty well. Did you have a good week?
Yeah, it's a good week. Good week. Lots of activity, lots going on. We have some new projects starting, which is always exciting. It's always the forming, storming, norming sort of process of new projects, which is good. So it's get to performing as fast as we can.
You mean you have a day job? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's still here. So, yep. Yeah. But I do think there's a lot of there's a lot of activity. It's just interesting what's going on in the market with the labor market and and more that business wants to do than people available to do it. And so we're definitely seeing that in our business.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Maybe we'll have a whole episode on staffing when we get to staffing in general around IT and then AIOps. We'll put a little AIOps spin on it at some point. But yeah, I think it's the people shortage is an interesting thing. So, But we're here to talk about AIOps. Want to talk about some AIOps?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
All right, awesome. So we've got a few things today that. So I'm going to call an audible right now because a really interesting story hit yesterday around the guy with DoD that resigned.
Okay.
Did you hear about that?
No, I don't.
Oh gosh. Pentagon's X software. So let me.
I did see that actually.
Yeah, so
I saw
it's
the
pretty
headline.
interesting. So, so there's a number of titles because it's all over the place, right? China has won the AI battle with U.S. Pentagon's X software chief says. So, Nicholas Chalin, I don't know if I got that right, so apologize if I butchered that. Pentagon's first chief software officer who resigned in protest against how slow the pace of technological transformation in the U.S. military, saying the failure was putting the United States at risk. And he basically goes on to say, we have no competing fighting chance against China in 15 to 20 years. Right now, it's an already done deal. It's already over, in my opinion. Whether it takes a war or not is kind of anecdotal. And he's really talking about China's investment in AI and just really outpacing everything that we're doing, and also the reluctance of the slowness of the military and the reluctance of U.S. companies like Google to work with the DoD. So just really interesting. I think there's going to be a lot more coming on that story, and I really want to dig into it more, and maybe we'll talk about it next week. But that one just kind of hit hard last night. That was kind of a crazy headlines.
Yeah, one is, I guess, two thoughts. The one is that's quite a resignation letter to just throw the entire military industrial complex under the bus. But two, I think he hopes it is a wake up call. Obviously in China, the military and all of their industry is much more tightly coupled than here. Innovation in Silicon Valley and software doesn't necessarily correspond to, you see that technology in our military and our government, whereas in China it kind of is. And I think even some of the crackdowns happening against some of the technology companies in China is there probably is some pushback happening over there, but you can't push back quite as hard in China as maybe here in the US.
I mean, I'm no China expert, so I think it's going to take some time to sort through what that means. And I know, I mean, I do a fair amount of work in the cybersecurity space, and we have a podcast over there too, and we did a story probably a couple months ago about how far behind the U.S. government is on cybersecurity, and that the OMB actually gave them, most of the organizations, a failing, D grade, right?
Yeah.
I think only one was a B, and I think that was might have been DHS, I think, but
Okay.
most of them were D's and a few C's. So
Wow.
I probably don't, on the surface, just based on my experience, probably don't disagree with this guy that, we're getting further and further behind in some of these investments. But anyway, so AI in the news, we don't see AI in the news a lot, right? So seeing AI on the front line of CNN this caught my eye, right? So
Yeah.
but we'll come back to that later. I think that'd be interesting to talk about that. So the first article that I wanted to bring up real quick was It's called. It's written by Salvatore Salomone through RT Insights, which is Real Time Insights. He's a physicist, and basically he's a trained physicist and basically a tech writer, and been writing for, I think, a couple decades. And he wrote an article on performance monitoring challenges, solutions, and benefits. And we were going to talk about observability today. That's kind of the theme of today's show. And what he really did is he interviewed somebody from Siemens. And this is really all about IoT. And but what really, so when I was reading it, I thought, oh, IoT. But then I realized that it was really more about the industrial organizations and machinery and things like that. But as I'm reading it, I was just struck by how much it correlates to our IT today, right? And the correlation is just really amazing. So you start, it talks about, a lot of manual processes of consuming data and Excel spreadsheets. And I'm like, Excel spreadsheets are a mainstay in the IT organizations. Too many tools, for collecting data, no common platforms for doing it. Lots of legacy equipment, legacy manufacturing equipment, that how it needs to be managed and instrumented. Big time heterogeneous environments, lots of different vendors making all kinds of different machinery inside these industrial organizations. The need for intelligence to the data, the need for a cloud-based system for collection of data and creating a data model and standardization of that. And then the ability to build applications on top of that data, all this IoT data. And they talk about, this woman from Siemens talks about 3 applications of the Siemens platform. Semantic, which delivers alerts to managers to track the monitoring condition of their machines, which is like exactly what monitoring does in IT. Yes. Performance Insight provides machine and plant performance at a glance. We're talking about that. Collaboration, the Semantic Collaboration Board offers a collaborative solution to address production issues, lets managers share problems and solutions across teams. I mean, all this sounds so much like IT. I was just kind of like, wow, this is pretty interesting. And, and platforms like Splunk and Elastic and things like that, how they collect data. This is how things are unstructured and how they can use the Siemens application to gather tons of IoT data so they can actually diagnose the problem before they send a dispatch out there. Sounds familiar. And so it was just kind of interesting. And then they did talk about AI, right? And the ability that these systems are creating so much information that you're going to need some type of machine learning AI to basically process all this data from an observability perspective. They actually don't use the term observability in here, but it's basically all observability.
Yeah. Right.
So did you get a chance to see that article?
I did. And I the same thing as I read it, I just was like, oh, I'm curious to kind of read about what's the state of industrial monitoring. And it's like reading a story about a family and you're like, wait, this is my family, right? So it was very much the same story. And exactly where they are, and the Siemens talks about the tools they have to address it, MindSphere and Semantic, and it's the same sort of IT operations architecture as far as collecting performance data, metrics, displaying KPIs, running analytics on that, even end-to-end workflows for sort of how you manage that data and manage the information, and work tickets and incidents that happen. So it's all very much the same, and it reminded me of I think in ITSM, IDLE and ITSM, there's often been discussion of let's just remove IT, because really this is a framework for service management. And I think that general framework for for ITSM, IT service management, really is a very general framework that has aspects of it that's specific to IT, like software asset management or things like that. But I think even that applies anywhere else too. But I think it just applies across the board. And really, I think we just have to remind ourselves in the IT world that we're in the service management space, the service operations space, and whether it is a traditional router, cloud, application, the same things are happening in anything else that is connected to the internet, right? Or is connected to anything else, and the same methodologies, the same data collection, the same challenges apply. So, yeah, the last thing I'd say is, they talked about this being the cornerstone, like Siemens product, to digital transformation. And so even that term is, factories, robots, industrial, hospitals, the actual, systems that are actually doing care, or building products, building cars, building smart cities. I mean, that's all digitally transforming at the same time. Our IT is moving to the cloud and containers and everything else. So it's all interconnected.
Yeah, it was just if you swapped out like machines for routers, switches, servers, applications, microservices, you would actually have literally the exact same article.
Yep.
So
exactly.
it was just interesting. We're all in this alone, and the reality is that IT can play a major role in getting these these industrial organizations off the ground, because they're so they should be so used to collecting massive amounts of data and trying to process this, and they're looking at AIOps and AI and machine learning for processing data. They should be like kind of heading over to the business side and saying, hey, how can we bring our expertise to the table to help solve this problem around IoT?
Yeah.
And maybe even using the same systems, right? So if you can commonize the data models, right, and then inject those into your log management system or your data analytics system, whether it be Splunk or Elastic or Sumo or something like that, then you can now have a single common platform for collection of data and create a lot of the same applications. So just was interesting. I thought that was just thought it was interesting to bring up and just kind of bring context to what we do every single day. And quite honestly, maybe we're just not all that special.
Yeah.
How's that?
Well, I think of like CTO, CIO, and if you're GM and you've got factories with all kinds of automation and plants and, robots building cars and, all of that industrial automation, is that all fall under the CTO, whereas the CIO is a little more focused on the IT side, right? So, but it's still technology that's in your environment. And I think I've seen companies that have the CTO reporting to the CIO and vice versa. And I think it's sort of oriented towards what's the technology that's really differentiating you as a company, right? And there's roles, sort of this chief technology organization and the chief information sort of organization sort of are very intertwined with each other, or need to be.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So
good.
Cool.
Well,
all right. So you had an article that you wanted.
Yeah,
to
I
bring
did.
up.
I came across an article just again around observability. It was written by a senior technology advocate, Josh Atwell at Splunk. It actually didn't talk at all about Splunk. It was really about. It was titled "AIOps is the oxygen for your data: 4 steps to get started." And I thought that's interesting. I guess your data is a living thing, and in order to really make use of it, you need to supply it oxygen to live. And so it really made 4 key points, which I thought were all, useful, which is why we picked the article. But one is it's critical to identify and consolidate your data sources. And he has some input as to how to prioritize those data sources. The second one was defining the baseline. You got to understand from that data sources, where do you stand? I think the second thing is comparing patterns in real time. You got to be able to map and correlate your performance, systems and business, but then also, cross-system performance. And then really the fourth sort of step was watching the system to identify new patterns. You need to be learning from the system. So kind of 4 big picture points. I'll probably comment on a couple of them and then see what you thought about the article. But the first one he said is, first really focus on established data sources and start with infrastructure, move up to application performance. A couple of warnings there, maybe that isn't the right way to do it, is I think a lot of times organizations focus so much on let's just get all the data into one place without really saying, is this data we even should be pulling into one place? Is there a lot of noise we're just uselessly kind of pulling up into kind of a centralized system? And so I think there's some warnings about that. Don't just start with what you have if it's not even that useful. And then I think starting with the infrastructure, moving up to applications, I think application performance might be where a lot of companies want to start, because that's really the closer to the experience that the customers are receiving. And so I don't know if I necessarily agree with the prioritization, but I do think it is about getting the data sources and observability going to start with. And then I think he talks about baselining, defining your baseline. And I think I'll just comment that this is really where machine learning and AI ops, and you're really, what we see a lot of times in your performance management systems, need to have the ability to say, all right, we're pulling in important metrics, or maybe it's logs, maybe it's events, but here's what normal looks like. So you can start to having the system automatically generate alerts or generate problems based on establishing that baseline versus having to do static sort of thresholds or static rules. And so, I agreed with that, but I think it's just, the system that does it is typically your performance type system, performance monitoring type system. So do you have before I get into any more thoughts, any thoughts you had on this article?
Yeah, I had a few. I mean, you kind of hit on most of it. I thought I agree with you on the levels of service, and I think that when you start, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, when you start talking about observability, especially in a cloud environment,
Mm-hmm.
You can collect a lot of information regarding the infrastructure from like AWS or Azure or something like that, but the observability from like DevOps perspective is all really built in at the application level, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of agree with you on that. I would probably, if you've got to ultimately have the observability across the entire stack. Otherwise, if you're managing and collecting information at the observability level of the application and there's infrastructure issues, you may not know exactly where to look for that. But I think if you're going to start somewhere, I think it might depend too, right? It might depend if you're on a legacy systems where you're trying to collect information, and you're looking, but when you're in a cloud environment, you may be looking at, hey, we've got enough resiliency and dynamic sysm, is that a word,
Yeah.
in the infrastructure with AWS and Azure, that we really should be focused on the applications. So, but I think I agree there. The other thing when he talks about is baselining, you're really talking about running this for weeks or months, right? And collecting data for weeks or months before you start understanding your true baseline. And that's where, and that's where I think that AI ops and machine learning plays such a critical role in that, and in the whole process of observability, right? Because you're just going to have massive amounts of data, and then you're bringing in contextual data from third parties, and when you start overlaying that, humans just can't do it, right? And going back to that last article, you sure as heck don't want to be trying to do this through Excel spreadsheets and pivot tables and things like that. So you'll just never be able to keep up. So, that's kind of my.
Yeah, the last thing I just kind of back to the first point is, most organizations that are trying to get budget and trying to expand, you got to pay for AI ops, right? You got to pay for monitoring. And I think you got to justify that. And I think there's a big so what. And I think really if your customers and if the employees, if the applications are doing well and, there's no complaints, the response time is good. The refresh is good. The transaction support is good. Data throughput is good. There's a big so what as to why do we need to go deeper and try to monitor the containers or monitor the underlying servers or monitor the network. And so I think you sort of have to start with the overall experience. And if there's challenges there, then you sort of then that provides justification to invest in your monitoring at the deeper layers in the infrastructure. If you just start with the infrastructure, you're kind of not really tying the whole thing together.
Yeah. And I think there's a case to be made that the application in the end is really, the true measure of the customer experience, because it may not be an infrastructure issue. It may be, some type of response of queries into databases and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
And I think ultimately I think we've talked about this before, right? I mean, as the industry starts moving more to customer experience management and less so towards, infrastructure management, because a lot of the infrastructure is just kind of starting to become super resilient, right? And these are vendors like Cisco and Juniper, stuff like that are building out infrastructure, and is much more resilient than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And the introduction of SD-WAN, where you can make your network much more dynamic now. So these things are kind of playing out at the infrastructure level, and then so the application, and that's really the importance of DevOps. So
Yep.
So any other comments on that one? Because that's a pretty good lead into the next.
Yeah, no, I think so. Why don't we bring up the last, I think the main topic.
Yeah, so the main topic is really, it's kind of based on an article written by Jane Grohl, Jane Grohl, how to improve your observability systems. And it's really, so this was written at, she's the CEO of the DevOps Institute, and this was published on Tech Beacon. And this is kind of leading into the last conversation, and like how we left off. This is really all about DevOps and observability, but I think it's a great place to stay. There's a couple things. I'll just mention a few things, and I'd love to get your opinion. But start with culture, right? That's one of the things that she said. The nice thing about this article, there's a lot of quotes from people in the industry and what's important to them. So you kind of get a very diverse idea of what observability means. But she says start with culture, and culture is key to aspect of successful observability. Developers must adopt an open mindset, allowing team members a window into their processes while operations continue to report systems operations. So you're really looking at a collaboration of teams, which maybe in some environments that collaboration hasn't been there in the past. It's kind of been like, hey, we build applications and throw them over the and then she actually says to mix in automation and AIOps, right? Because in the end, we're back to this problem of bringing in observability into these applications and creating tremendous amounts of data through containers and microservices and backend infrastructure. And you're only going to be able to do it with being able to process massive amounts of data, looking at new patterns, dynamic patterns, and things like that. So everything we've talked about. So I will stop there. I have some more thoughts, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I kind of the first thing I noted was just to start with your culture aspect, and I think every time you sort of have to put in place an operation center, right, a network operation center, data center operation center, or cloud operations, or command center, that's really overhead. You're now kind of creating a big brother or something that's going to look across everything. And who you staff that with are generalists, right? Unless you can really afford to have teams and experts in specific areas. And so I think a lot of companies are looking at how do we do more with less. It is about how do we kind of eliminate some of that overhead, which really means putting the intelligence and the information out at the edge. And so the developers that are building the products or the engineers building the infrastructure, it's get observability into those systems. And the incentive is that information is now going to become available to you in making sure you're preventing and getting information to be able to run and operate it. So the investment is made to really make their life easier when there is issues or there are things, or you can monitor performance. And then I think with that data, it's again pushing machine learning out. It's pushing even automation capabilities out to be able to kind of put that control or put that sort of enablement, out at those edges at those teams. And so, I think, and that's where she talks about mixing in automation and AIOps really into observability. If you can observe, you can analyze, and then you can automate the fix, and all that happens in the domain that the developers are responsible for, the engineers are responsible for. That's great, right? You don't have to kind of bring it up into a big centralized command center. And I think the last point she made is just the bottom line is it takes less time and effort for developers to fix problems in a highly observable system. And that's what it's really about. So,
I think, not to belabor this cultural point, but I will refer back to, I think, a conversation we had weeks ago, right, when we were talking about DevOps. And the surprising statistics that I saw, that was like only something like 25% of companies are self-claiming that they have adopted AIOps principles, and that a lot of and like 50% think that they'll be further along next year. I don't remember the exact statistics, but it was something like that. And you sit there and you say, okay, well, why in all these years we've been talking about DevOps, why do we not have why have more companies not embraced the full DevOps philosophy and operating model? And I contend that it's culture, right? And they haven't solved the culture issue of getting silo teams to come together and work together. So they're out there, they're buying platforms for DevOps and agile release of code, but they're not going to full. And they think that's DevOps because they bought a DevOps platform, but they haven't kind of gone that full cultural integration of the teams. And that's going to be critical for observability, because you've got to get the observability components built into the application during the build process, during the dev process. And and there's been some, and they bring up some things around protocols that are making it easier to do that, like open telemetry, which is an open source platform for embedding agents and collection into applications that can then generate data into common collectors that can then be put into and pulled out. So you work with something like open telemetry, you then and you develop to that, then you have the ability to output data in more of a common model. But all this takes time and it takes collaboration. So it's I think that ultimately we need to be looking at how do we get these teams together to cooperate, and how do we break down silos, and looking at, and then how does AIOps play into this? And she actually says, AIOps is key to observability. We won't survive really without it, because you're just collecting so much data. And so if you can break down the culture barriers, right, and you can understand that once you do that and you start bringing in observability into the DevOps really philosophy and operating model, and start bringing in observability at the dev point, and using products like open telemetry or something like that, and then start generating a lot of data, and then having that data being processed through AIOps and machine learning, and then being able to bring that data back to the application teams for them to be doing troubleshooting and application improvement. You've kind of then complete the full circle, except for the fact that you might be looking at automation along the way too, right? And how do you use that data to automate certain things to either activate more resources for load balancing, or automatically generate incidents back into the app team so they can do hot fixes faster, things like that.
Right. Yeah, I think with the culture, again, there are too many. You're doing it wrong when the people feel like the tools are being implemented. It's happening to us, right? It's something we got to deal with. This is the decision's been made, and I think the second kind of not as bad as it's happening for us, right? Like, all right, the intention's good, but I think really it's you want to get to culturally that you're really allowing these organizations and staff and the engineers to be able to do things for themselves, and give them the tools, give them what they need to really do their job, and that also then generates the incentive to create the data, to create the things that they need to. So I think it's it kind of all goes full circle, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on the phone yesterday with a very large electronics company, online company, and they're basically a developer mindset. And what they were saying is what they're really trying to do is empower the developers, right? And you empower the developers with data, right? And the more you can give them the data, the better they can build applications. So it's not necessarily a top-down approach of understanding how do we manage down. It's about getting data back into developers so they can actually they can manage from the bottom up, right? They have the data to make better applications and deliver better services. So good. Any other comments on this?
No, I think we covered it. It was good.
I think we put a fork in that one.
We hammered it home.
Hammered it home. Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Again, my name is Sean McDermott. Co-host is Bill Driscoll. This episode is sponsored by Windward Consulting Group. You can find them at www.windward.com. Windward is the global leader in AIOps. So you can hit their website and find all kinds of information about AIOps and articles and research and studies and things like that they've been doing. So I highly encourage you to do that. And I again appreciate you guys, everyone tuning in. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and please click the little bell so you can be notified when we put these things out. But we put these things out every Friday afternoon in time for the weekend. So you got a little bit of time over the weekend to listen to us yammer on about AIOps. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Yep.
Have a great weekend,
See you next
Bill.
week. You too. See you, Sean.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.